We trust the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant.
You say that 1776 made us who we are. Who exactly are we?
So I adapt an acronym from some psychologists, particularly a man called Joseph Henrich, who's a Harvard psychologist, and I adapt an acronym from him. He uses the acronym WEIRD. He says that we are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And I add to that, we are also ex-Christian and romantic, to make the word weirder. And I say that's really what I mean by we. It's primarily people like you and me and many, many others who live in, there might be up to 1 billion people who live in what we would think of as the modern West, but the West is not just a geographical conceit. It does reflect certain attitudes to education, industrialization, wealth, public policy and government, and particularly something that comes through a lot in the way I'm telling the story is our sort of the twin influences of Romanticism and Christianity as forming, the sort of two oceans which mingle and create a lot of life, but also create a lot of instability. And that's who we are. Now, there's plenty of people who might read it from a very different perspective and go, yeah, that is what's weird about the West. But my guess is that the vast majority of people who read it will be reading it as it's describing them. And that's the hope. So that's who I mean by we.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a helpful acronym because it's obviously a double entendre. We take everything you just said in the West for granted. This is just the way things are. And the reality is that throughout human history and even in the world today, it's weird. The way we think, the way we live, our culture is strange. It's weirder in human history. Could you give us just a quick crash course on each one of those little items and what you mean by Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, ex-Christian, and romantic?
Yeah. So Western is the strangest one because if you look at a globe, you would never say that the West or the Western nations are in the West. Like you'd say, how is Australia part of the same bit of the world as Canada? It just seems very incoherent. But I think Western, as I use it, means the nations that were part of Western Christendom or were colonized by parts of Western Christendom to such a degree that their demography and institutions reflect European nations. So basically the West starts somewhere in Latin Europe, so the sort of Latin-speaking Europe in the Middle Ages, and then all the nations that are effectively, now been colonized by and have their institutions profound and economies profoundly shaped by it. I think you then have some nations which were sort of greater or lesser, the Western to a greater or lesser degree, because obviously that I'm describing, in some ways I'm describing Colombia as much as I'm describing France, and you would say France is a more classically Western nation than Colombia, but I think as a broad overview, that's what I mean by Western. Educated, I mean, not just that you have been educated at all, of course, everybody educates their children in certain ways, but I think in the West there is an expectation that education will often not only be useful for the job you're going to do, but that there is a value to learning extraneous information and having a value on education, and even that education is a marker of status, and that in many ways someone, say, who is a tenure professor at Harvard might earn less than someone who did a much less glamorous job, but their money wouldn't attribute the status there. Education would confer a lot of prestige. And that's the way our world works. Is we value education in a particular way, and we think that you and I should learn trivial things just for fun, which is what this conversation is. And that's not how many nations in history would have thought. Industrialized, I think, is more self-evident. We are profoundly shaped by the Industrial Revolution and industrial technology. We don't live on the land. We work in offices or factories. Rich, again, we are this side of the enormous hockey stick jump in wealth that kicked in really from the late 18th century. And so we have dramatically more wealth, goods, services, life expectancy, well-being in terms of measured in physical ways. We're much less likely to die in childbirth or much less likely to live in agonizing pain than people before because we are wealthy. Democratic, again, fairly self-explanatory, but our government assumes that it's based on the consent of the people, and different nations have different ways of measuring what the people think about things, but that's the expectation. Ex-Christian means that we have inherited a Christian legacy of morality and values which run very deep, even though culture as a whole is trying to leave them behind. We're still profoundly shaped by Christian categories. And then romantic means that we have been marinated in the art and vision of the self and the soul and what art and music and poetry and emotions mean, and that our current framework, even if we don't think that we are romantic in the sort of I'm in love kind of way, that's not really what we mean. I mean, we have been profoundly shaped in our understanding of those things by romanticism, which is a sort of very late 18th, early 19th century artistic movement in Europe, and particularly Germany and then France, which has profoundly shaped us all.
I'm Patrick. Thanks for watching this video. If you're passionate about ending tribalism in the church and giving Jesus your allegiance, you're not alone. We have a podcast and a book. They're both called Truth Over Tribe. You can download the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can buy the book on Amazon. I hope you'll check them out.